So, hey guys, welcome back to Out of Band. My name is Jennifer Winnekers.
And my name is Faith Opio.
And today we are joined by a very special dear friend of mine, Erik Schneider. He is a former ex-colleague of mine. I know him also very well on a personal note, and I'm very, very delighted that he will be joining us today to talk about insider risk. Erik, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yes, well, first, again, thank you, Jennifer and Faith, for inviting me on this. Big supporter and very happy to discuss insider risk. So my name is Erik Schneider. I'm a director with Signpost Six. Signpost Six is a boutique insider risk consultancy and training firm based in The Hague. We really focus on the threat from nation states stealing IP and trade secrets. And then the second part that we really focus on is criminal infiltration to organizations like the harbors or the police or other organizations. We do less on sabotage, less on fraud, which is also covered by insider risk as well.
Yeah. And that is actually why we wanted to invite you today, because insider risk is extremely broad, but when most people actually think about insider risk, they usually think of the typical disgruntled employee. Maybe, Faith, if you're also okay with that, let's just immediately jump into the topic. What would you actually describe as insider risk? Like, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so insider risk is a very old threat, or insider threat is a very old threat going back to mythology and religious texts. There are cases of insider threats described there. As a discipline, it's relatively new. And of course, the intelligence agency and the military probably had some kind of capability about insider threats. But I think as a discipline, it really started probably around 2011, I believe. Well, Chelsea Manning, the Chelsea Manning case prompted the US to issue a number of executive orders, which required anyone working with the US Defense or the Pentagon, they had to establish an insider threat program. And I'm sure for many of these organizations, it was just another hat that someone else was wearing. But in the US, they have, let's say, some liberal policies about monitoring people. And so, and especially in the federal government and the defense sector, they take a very heavy monitoring approach. So I think that when people know about insider threat, and actually I would say that in the US, it's really called insider threat. In Europe, that does not land very well because they have different perspectives about monitoring here. So insider risk is also, that's the term that we use, but some organizations find that offensive. So there are a lot of different ways to label this. But for the most part, insider threats can include data theft, including espionage. It can include sabotage, IT sabotage, but also other sabotage at nuclear plants and oil and gas. It includes fraud, financial fraud, workplace violence. So this is not only shooting, active shooters, but bullying, harassment, insider trading, if there's an insider risk component. And pretty much the way we define it, anything that an employee can do that can damage the company can be included. But there are problems when you expand it too much, because there are parts of the organization that are already working on these. And even though you can make a theoretical argument that because it involves a human interacting with their environment, that really you want to maintain that expertise in one central unit, that's often not the case. And if it's too broad, then because these different threat types have different profiles. Some are low and slow, like espionage. Some are very quick, like sabotage. So they have different profiles, and it's hard to be a master of all of them.
Yeah. And just for our viewers, because we have different skill sets, could you just explain what sabotage and espionage is to level set?
Yeah, so first, espionage. So espionage is a subset of data theft. So normal data theft would be someone leaving their employer and taking a couple slide decks that they created. Espionage is something where a nation state is using their intelligence agency to either manipulate people or to really handle someone inside the organization. And that's a much more serious threat because they have, it's much more difficult to detect a professionally handled spy. Some people would say it's almost impossible, but they are really after very important trade secrets and intellectual property. Sabotage, I think we distinguish between IT sabotage, although with the operations, with OT and everything is coming down to something with software.
Yeah.
But sabotage is when someone either deletes a server or deletes a whole data center. It could be manipulating the configuration on some manufacturing plants to make that a certain function or pressure valve, for example, reduce the tolerance, so explodes essentially. So they're either trying to do physical damage by manipulating the configuration files, or it's sabotage, mostly wiping, putting logical bombs and wiping data off. Now, ransomware is a good example. It's ransomware, an insider threat. People click on it, it puts ransomware on. It's an insider that has to click on it. I don't know. These are the areas where I think if you go too broad, it's probably not helpful.
Yeah, makes sense.
But that's then also potentially where you get to the question, can insider risk also be unintentional, for example?
Absolutely. So it's one of that's not what we focus on. But if you look at the vendors that in the space, that is absolutely one of the, and some vendors are just focused on that unintentional insider threat. And again, that's a different profile. That's people under stress, people distracted, just making innocent mistakes. And it's probably, if you look at frequency, by far, unintentional threats are the most frequent events, and maybe not be the most damaging, but in the aggregate, they're significant.
Yeah.
And how often, I know that you focus on insider threat, but as a whole, if we look at threats within an organization, what's the percentage that you normally come across for insider threat? Is it rather high?
Yeah, again, it depends on the industry. So like in financial services, fraud is ever present, even internally. I would say places like oil and gas, I think sabotage, physical sabotage is probably much higher. And then those with where IP is very highly valued by other nation states. So if you look at the semiconductor industry, the pharmaceutical industry, high tech, data theft is there. So I would, but how prevalent it is in these organizations. I think for data theft, for what we do, I think for most organizations, okay, they always have slide decks going out when people leave, but they're going to survive that. I don't know if I would spend a lot of money. You can get tools already. You can get the amateurs that are downloading 5 gigabytes, and you can catch them before. But for those that are dealing with nation state, it's only a few industries. I would say for those like semiconductor, like pharmaceuticals, like seed research companies, I think they probably have a case, and this is for what they can see. I'm sure they have a case easily every year. And again, these are the real serious cases, because if they lose their disruptive IP that they're banking their strategy on, it's it's an existential risk. But in those industries that are highly targeted, I would say that they would have at least one case a year, but more likely, if they have the visibility that they could have, it's probably happening more than once a year, because depending on the nation states, they never just put one spy in the company. They have more than one because they want this. They check the spies to see if the spies are reporting back accurate information.
Yeah,
basically ensuring whether or not they're successful or not, and if one fails, then another can still pick it up.
I always find it interesting that these nation states and criminal organizations, they practice risk management. So when an organized crime group infiltrates the police, that's risk management. That's a risk management action. So I'm always saying, like, your adversaries are practicing risk management. You might want to take it more seriously as well.
I mean,
but that's exactly
it's
what they're
sad, but
doing.
yes.
I mean, having redundancy in terms of your collection agents, that's also risk management. So some people are using risk management. We wish more would take it seriously.
I mean, usually you do see that like the adversaries are way better prepared, way more serious about their approach and all, unfortunately. Yeah.
So I have a question with regards to how often or how prevalent is the topic of insider risk or insider threat looked into when it comes to smaller organizations? Is it something that is just managed by the larger organizations, or do you also see a tendency on the smaller organizations?
I think the awareness is definitely much more at the multinational level,
Okay.
partly because they have the tools.
Okay.
Visibility is one of the biggest issues, and there's a big difference in awareness geographically as well. So in the US, especially, there's it's been a topic for a decade and a requirement for a decade. In Europe, I'll say this, Signpost Six has been around for 6 years. Even when I joined in 2020, we really thought that we were like the first real pure play in the continental Europe. But it was very tough. Not many companies were, calling us or anything like that. Now, I would say in the last 6 months, we get more calls from organizations in Europe asking about it. But, at the smaller level, in the small and medium, we have given talks to, for example, the agricultural tech sector in the Netherlands, because when you have a cluster of very small companies like we have in Eindhoven, for example, or in Boston, these biotech, it's almost like in nature what an ecosystem is. They all cross-pollinate, and they really become centers of excellence. And you can name them in the pharmaceuticals. It's Boston, it's some places in Switzerland, some places in the UK. These are really the centers. But if you start losing the IP from those clusters, it's not just a company that loses. That cluster will be broken up, and at a national or even regional level, the competitiveness is damaged. So we talk to small companies. The problem is that they really don't have much capacity to start. To start a program. We've been doing some thinking about what they can do in terms of self-assessments. But even those that want to start, they're in survival mode. Whereas I think the large multinationals, of course, they're in a very cutthroat market, but they have more money to spend on this. I do think that I would say the awareness, even when you talk to CEOs, some get it, some do not. But the awareness is, for most of them, the first time they've ever heard of this subject and that they would ever consider it. But
isn't it also the case that with smaller companies you usually have more implicit trust because everyone knows each other and everyone trusts each other and cannot think of someone being intentionally or unintentionally malicious?
Yes, I think that's definitely in play. Not in my team. That would not. That happens in large organizations as well. Like this never happens. And that's where cases, and if you have internal cases, that's where they're most powerfully used, is there's a book that was called The 10 Worst Practices in Insider Risk. And like number one is that not on my team. Like we've been together for 20 years, it doesn't happen. And then you present a case where this exactly happened. Especially in these high tech, because there's a lot of research done with universities as well. That's a risk. But I would also say this is one of the ways that nation states also capture IP, is that either they buy out small firms, or they attract people and say, hey, we'll fund your startup. And then they'll go and take this technology and fund the startup. And, the nation state doesn't care if that startup survives, because they've already collected it and brought it back, for repurposing, for using it for another purpose. But startups is a space that is not very well controlled, but and nation states know that. So I do think, looking broader, the nation state will try to hack externally. They will try to, and if they're blocked externally, it's not like, oh, that's too bad, we're done. No, they will track internally. They will try to buy out companies. They will try to lure engineers into creating companies. It's a really big problem for organizations of all sizes.
Yeah.
So I'd like to shift to a different question. How can a company protect, defend, and mitigate insider threats? So let's start with protecting. How do you avoid it? How do you protect against it?
So I'm going to take the case of data theft, and I'll just focus on that. So data theft, it actually starts where, you know, cybersecurity starts, is identifying your critical assets, and really identifying those are most critical. There's one client, it took 18 months to identify their critical assets because they initially started with 10,000 pieces of IP blocks. They whittled that down to 100, and even that 10,000 was the tip of the iceberg. Eventually, they got it down to 126. And then after that, because there are tools that you use to monitor this. So DLP is often applied to this. Also UEBA, so that's user and entity analytic behavior solutions. One is rule-based, that's the data loss prevention systems. Data loss preventions need DLP systems really need structured processes, and people need to do things like one way, whereas UEBA is more probabilistic. But both have problems with too many false positives. And if you're not focused, or you're covering 10,000, 100,000 people, you have UEBA, you're never going to extract value. So what we recommend is, really do the work to identify the most disruptive IP, limit the channels of access to them, and then put these tools around them. Now that is, as you describe,
maybe as a stupid question, but how do you actually determine that? Because I've been working now, for example, for almost 8 years in cybersecurity, and the thing that most of my clients always have an issue with is determining their crown jewels, determining their most critical assets, because everyone has a different opinion, and everyone finds their asset more important than that specific asset, for example.
Yeah, well, this is always a problem. And even in this one organization that had finally focused on these 100, whatever, it's 130, everyone kept going and saying, and saw the success of their program and say, hey, you've got to include my asset in that. And they were told no. So they held, like I said, 1.5 years of workshops, really whittling down. But it really involved the business. So this is actually, this company, the flag was raised from the business side, because in the one R&D department, I think 40 people left the organization and joined a startup to an organization across the street. Like they really had a burning platform when you have that. But they've had more people, like they've had other parts of the organization where 10 people left to the same organization. But the business, raise the flag and say, hey, we need to do something about this. We need to do more protective measures. But I also want to step back about in order to protect against insider threat of all types, there are some models out there, and one of them is called the critical pathway to insider risk. This was research that was done by Erik Shaw and I forget his co-author, but Erik Shaw is a behavioral psychiatrist. He's worked with the CIA and the FBI, and they reviewed 1,500 cases of real insider threats. And what they created was a conceptual pathway that insiders take. And the first is problematic, or not problematic, it's just personal predispositions. So these are people who can't hold a job, or they have some social interaction difficulties. It also could be in their network. So what do they bring into the organization? Maybe they have some ties to organized crime, for example. The next step on the pathway is some stressors. This could be financial stressors, personal stressors. it's something that is adding to the situation.
Mhm.
And then a lot of cases, if you look at insider threat, the person that eventually committed the act was displaying concerning behaviors in front of everyone, or and even maybe even advertising what they were doing and telling people, I'm gonna, you know, when I leave, I'm going to, you know, put this malware on all the computers. Then often there's an inappropriate organizational response. So that
As
comes
in
either
it's not taken seriously, or people just laugh it off, or
yeah, so either they were too hard and they just fired the person, and the person later did cut off all the access, and then they, you know, or they didn't want to deal with the problem, and this often happens a lot when there's a problem employee. Most of the time they'll try to get them into another unit, but you know, taking on a problem like that, especially when you're a middle manager, it looks like work, and even though it's the right thing to do, they have to get work done. They're under tremendous pressure to, you know, to meet targets, and so well, they don't take it seriously. And then the final part is when the individual, after displaying concerning behaviors, they're at what's called the crime script, and the crime script is when they're actually practicing. You know, they're doing trial runs or seeing what the limits are. They're calling the IT desk to figure out what they can and cannot do. And most tools can catch people at the crime script stage. What we've been trying to do is trying to get further left and actually prevent that from happening. So you can add positive incentives. So employee assistance programs help a lot. But I was going to say that in the insider risk domain, it's so young that we're actually now, there are some challenges to the insider or the critical pathway to insider risk. There was prior research called Project Slammer, which was looking at espionage cases, and there are, you know, these are well-known kind of models. And I would say MITRE in the US that does a lot of research, MITRE attack chain or attack matrix, but they're doing a lot of research, and they have actual behavioral psychiatrists who are working on this problem. And what they say is that even though like the critical pathway is a nice conceptual model, it's not predictive. Things like mice is what a lot of people are familiar with when in terms of espionage, because they're motivated by money, by ideology, by ego, or, but that also isn't the case. I think that I think in 5 or 10 years, we're going to learn a lot more about what is predictive, because the data says, and Erik Schneider would say, that even someone displaying concerning behaviors, only 1 in 1,000 actually commit a damaging act. So it's really finding that needle in the haystack, collecting all the dots, because cybersecurity, information security, they have some of the dots about their digital behavior. HR has some dots about whether they weren't promoted, for example, and disgruntled that way. Physical security may have some dots, and rarely are they brought together. But the biggest observer and the best observer are their coworkers on the floor. They're around them all the time, and they have the business context. But most people are not willing to call a confidential hotline, either because they don't trust the hotline, or if they report it to HR. And I think like, let's say for sexual harassment, they don't believe that HR will always side with the senior executive, and they don't trust that. And that is a big problem for all of these risks. And yeah, we need to do better at that as a society.
I think the third reason, sorry, Jennifer, I think the third reason will be that some people don't want to be seen as snitches, so they won't report.
Also, yes.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. And even for managers who have concerns, yeah, it looks like they're making it personal. And if you can have some kind of tool that helps them say, hey, listen, I have to meet this guideline, and you've checked 5 out of the 7 criteria, so I have to report that. It takes, you can blame the tool and not the person, but indeed, people don't want to be as snitches. And yeah, and if it ever was found out that that person, that's a very heavy weight. And insider risk is really damaging because yeah, you can also get people reporting intentionally, but once person has a label that they may be an insider threat, and later exonerated, that stigma never goes away. So that's why the case management process really has to be secure and anonymized and with high sensitivity.
Yeah.
I mean, based on what I hear right now, it just really evolves right now around trust and around culture within your organization. And if you have issues with the both of them, then people will be less inclined to actually do something about it.
Yeah, yeah, and leadership well, I mean, that's where all the trust it stems down from. But leadership, people notice what's rewarded and what's punished. Great that the leadership supports the program and gives budget for it, but the leaders are reckless and harassing people. People can see right through phony statements. Like we have all these great program on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but yeah, people know what the reality is on the ground. So, and yeah, for insider risk, and we talked about how it's going to be framed within the organization. If you say this is really an employee trust program, it's not an employee threat program, it's an insider, or that's not an insider threat program, it's an employee trust program, and then you monitor them. People are not fooled. If this is a trust program, why are you monitoring us? So you have to be transparent, or else people will become cynical of the program, and it'll stop pretty quickly.
Yeah, makes sense.
So, are there instances whereby you've been able to catch an insider risk or an insider threat? While it's happening.
Absolutely. So that there are some pretty public cases. For example, at Pfizer was implementing, I believe, a DLP system, but it may be UEBA. I have to go back to the case, for example. And during the pilot, they discovered this person was stealing a lot of IP, which they never would have saw before because they were trying to download it. It was caught right in the pilot, and it was and they prosecuted the case and they won. So what I often say, because in Europe, again, they're really averse to monitoring their employees, and I think that that's fine. What I would say is that
small nuance. It's not an aversion. It's more that it needs to be transparently communicated, and it definitely needs to be within specific restrictions.
Absolutely, and I was going to say that even with the German, even the toughest works councils, you can do monitoring. It's funny because if you talk to different people in the organization, that's one of the things that we do when we interview people. But if you talk to a data privacy officer who's a little lower, they say you can't do that, you cannot monitor. You talk to the general counsel, and they'll say, of course we can do this, but you have to have a case. The works council also realizes the importance that you can't have employees, and I think most people want their bad peers caught, because then everyone else doesn't get tarnished by that. But really what we also say is that when a person commits an insider act, they damage the organization, but they also damage themselves. And if you see an employee or coworker struggling, you're doing it for the organization, but you're also doing it for that person. If the goal is to get that person help, maybe the stigma is not there. But the final thing I was going to say about monitoring is that you can trust your employees too much. And for the organizations that we've worked with in Europe, when they turn on the tool, they're amazed. You probably trust your employees a little less if you knew everything that they were doing with the data that they have access to. Doesn't mean that they're malicious, but they're quite surprised.
So we shall be advancing zero trust within organizations, I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
Trust nobody.
Yeah, it's sad, but it's effective.
Yeah. I guess the question, Jennifer, do you want to?
Yeah, no, so I think we can move on to the next part. So just kicking the open door open. we've been in the pandemic for the last 2 years. There's been a huge move from working in the office, working on site, to working at home or working at remote locations. What has that done for insider risk, insider threats, and trust towards the employees?
And if I may add to that, because I know, when people were working in one place, you'd have like the DLP systems or devices or mitigations in place. But then when people are working from anywhere, it's a little bit more difficult. So how has that changed your landscape?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When people work remote, their perception of being monitored, they feel that they're a little more anonymous, and they don't feel that they're being monitored. And that probably is the case for many organizations, certainly in the beginning. So does that cause people to become insider, commit damaging insider acts? I don't think it's a factor that someone all of a sudden, when they're alone, they start becoming malicious. Again, usually it's a combination of a stress, because it was very stressful in the beginning. People, everyone was working at home and the kids were going to school at home, added to a lot of stress, and a lot of people lost their jobs. So I do think, if you look at the reports, but a lot of these reports like Poneman, which I'm always a little skeptical of, the numbers have gone up in the pandemic. There was also a very interesting report that it was related to trading and finance, that the Security and Exchange Commissions in the US actually saw an increase in the whistleblower hotline in 2020. Really? And you talked about the culture and would you blow the whistle on your employees? And on these trading desks, there's a very tight culture. They work hard, they play hard together. And now that when they were all at home, they had less tolerance of seeing they were more readily to call the whistleblower hotline. Yeah. It wasn't like 100% jump, but I thought that was interesting as well. But now, so that was in the beginning, because like I said, they felt like they're a little less monitored. And I think those people on the edge, let's say at risk, and now you've put them in you've added that stressful situation. And now they've learned that they may lose their job, or there's another reorg coming on. It could be that it tipped over the edge, and that may explain the increase that reports see. What you do notice, for example, is that the number of people who took pictures with their cameras, that they catch people taking screenshots, increased, I think, 100%. So the way they're doing things is a little differently, but yeah, so I would say it's kind of, to some extent, they felt that they could maybe more free to call out bad behavior by their coworkers. At the same time, I do think the stress of it in the beginning, and the feeling that they're a little more anonymized and no one is looking at what they're doing, maybe a small percentage. I don't want to overstate it, but I definitely think in some cases it probably did push them over the edge.
Interesting.
I mean, it's allowing more freedom, so of course people will be more inclined to do things that they normally wouldn't.
I think it's interesting now that companies are putting much more monitoring equipment for remote workers. I wonder if that's changed, because now they're being notified that they are being monitored more, and it'll be interesting to see if there are changes. There should be changes. There should be periods when insider risk goes down, at least for remote workers, and but we don't have enough data. It's this was a problem in cybersecurity. Now that they have to report breaches, we have a little better data, but insider risk is handled very discreetly inside. Usually they get the person out of the organization and no one ever hears of it.
I'm interested in how insider risk investigations happen. Do you have, because I can imagine that maybe you have to have the presence of HR, obviously, legal. Are there other people that are involved in that whole investigation other than the investigator themselves?
The way most organizations do it, they usually have, you have a number of triggers that can come in. It could come in from a manager or a worker calling the confidential hotline. It could come from a technical tool if you have some technical tools that come in place. And so usually there's some triage that happens, like a technical triage. Let's just say it starts there. then this alert always has to have more context, and that's one of the things about insider risk. You can go to the business and say, hey, this activity looks suspicious, but maybe the business says, well, this is explainable. You have to have that context, and I think that's what makes it difficult. A lot of organizations try to staple this onto their SOC, and the SOC people often don't really have the background. As you know, SOC people the good ones are very expensive, but a lot of SOCs are staffed by juniors, and the junior doesn't understand the business. And an insider risk analyst really needs to understand the business context and has to be able to talk to business leader and have credibility with the business leader. But normally it'll come into one central point. It could be, for example, the ethics committee, which are handling other cases. And then usually, depending on the case, the person who is in charge or who has authority for this will set up a specific team to investigate. And they pick people from, let's say, that business unit. Legal needs to be involved, HR needs to be involved, and then IT security, and maybe physical security. But it's usually never one team. Some organizations want to have an investigative group kind of stable, but I think that because you need that context, other people are involved. And it could be that the investigator reaches out and gets the information they need from these subject matter experts. But some organizations, like I said, they either have a fraud department, which they try to expand, but it has to come in someplace. And for organizations that are not that big, or they're not, this is the first time they're really conducting invest, they don't have a fraud department, they really have to be careful, because we talked about the sensitivity, and you have to keep everything and make sure that people who have access to this are vetted, and have a lot of procedures about ensuring the confidentiality of it.
I mean, speaking on the confidentiality, I can imagine that even, especially if you as an organization are not 100% sure that the insider is an actual insider and actually performing malicious activities, are you aware of, for example, any legislation around handling this specifically, either in Europe or, for example, in the US?
I mean, outside of the existing, the short answer is no. No, I mean, outside of the existing privacy laws, but you have to get it in Europe. You have to get it by the Works Council if you're going to do monitoring. And what they often look for is transparency. They want to make sure that the labor lawyers are involved and privacy lawyers are involved, and that they often don't want tools making decisions. So they want a human looking at this case, and they want transparency. But if you can meet those, then you can do limited monitoring. But it's such a different, in the US, you can start collecting data, and then you go to court. But like in Europe, you have to state your reason before you start to collect. It's a completely different mindset.
Yeah.
So I can imagine the challenges encountered with companies that are multinational, where they have, offices in the US and they have European offices, so they can't really apply the same rules
everywhere, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you have to take a jigsaw puzzle approach, because you're dealing with so many regulatory regimes. For multinationals, you'll never have a uniform program, and that's costly to have a jigsaw approach, but you have to do it.
Yeah.
Would you recommend organizations to have some sort of a playbook ready to actually be able to deal with insider risk whenever it occurs?
Yes, so I think there needs to be like a run book of sorts, because you want to be transparent, and in Europe you want to, when you talk to the Works Council, it's like, this is how we make decisions. It's one of the problems when you start throwing machine learning at it, because you don't really know what the model is and how it's making decisions. So you want to be, but you also want to ensure consistency. So a case in one part of the organization is treated as fairly as the other part of the organization. And people need tools. This is not going to be their full-time job doing insider, and you can investigate these cases. And if you look at some of these spy cases, you can analyze these cases for a year, and I don't know if you'd make a better decision. So, what you need is, like, what is the criteria in order to start a case? So it's not just a bunch of points. You also have to know, like, let's say the case is, let's say a false positive, or there's still some doubts, like how long do you keep that case? Because like, do you want to open it back up again in another 6 months? Or have you thrown it away? Because if a person has repeated patterns over time, that also builds the case against them. How long do you retain the records? There needs to be, there's actually a lot that goes on to case investigations. But you'd be surprised at how many times it's just, you know, not finger in the air quite, but, you know, based on experience. But humans are incredibly inconsistent. You probably have heard of the judges in Israel for parole hearings. Yeah, Faith,
Before lunch like and after lunch.
Yes, before lunch, depending on how lean they would, you know, whether you got parole, really a big factor is how long has it been since that judge ate a meal. It's crazy.
Faith, I thought you wanted to say something.
No.
Okay.
No, I think I read that in I think Thinking Fast or Slow or something of the sort. I think that's where it was.
And Daniel Kahneman's new book, Noise, which came out last year, it's all about inconsistent. Not only do different people, like if you're talking about given a loan and given the same set of facts, different people make that different choices, but the same person will make the same choice presented with the exact same information on a different day. So humans are inconsistent if they're not guided by some tools.
Yeah, I really wanted to read that book. I saw it came out. Now you reminded me, I had to write it down. Yeah.
I mean, also looking a little bit at the time, maybe it's good to go to next topic.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So could you maybe share a couple of insider threat indicators? Like, how would you actually recognize something is happening? And we've talked already a bit about humans being inconsistent, but considering the fact that this is a specific working field and this is a specific specialism within the industry, there must be some sort of common factors that you can recognize. Yeah,
so there are a number of that, and I encourage listeners that they want a good overview. There's a report from NATO Center of Excellence called the Insider Threat Study, came out in 2016, and they describe for each of these types of insider threats what indicators, and they have network indicators, they have system indicators, they have behavioral indicators, they have background indicators. So, you know, we always say that you have to put all the dots together. So it really starts on the background checks. Again, what kind of networks do they have? What is their history? A lot of times it's amazing. A person has committed fraud in a prior organization, and yet they're still let into a new organization. But yeah, if you had checked that they had a conviction for fraud, that, you know, that happens quite a lot. For data theft, like I said, there are a lot of network tools that are getting better. They still have a long way to go. And I mentioned earlier that MITRE is working on really predictive tools. So it's always easy to tell a story looking backwards. But I know MITRE is doing a lot of good work on what exactly tools that you can use. So for example, so what are some of the indicators? Someone renaming files and encrypting it and then uploading it. And a lot of these insider risk tools, they sequence these events. So someone has downloaded something, they've changed the name, they've put it in a zip file, they've encrypted it and renamed it, and then they've re-uploaded it to someplace else. That is, if you can put that sequence together, that warrants a conversation to say what was going on there.
Why are you doing this?
Yeah. So, and I think that, like I said, the tools nowadays can do that. I think 10 years ago, they couldn't string these events. So you can see maybe someone, if you check the log files, you really need an expert to say, wow, that's strange. Like, why did they rename these files or this particular file? But those are the type of indicators that tools can detect. And again, if people are advertising, it's surprising how often people are advertising what they're going to do. And I think most organizations, we talked about taking confidential reporting very seriously. We need to do that. But that NATO insider threat study, it really breaks down for each of these. And I think their tables are based on Carnegie Mellon. So Carnegie Mellon in the United States, and their CERT has a whole unit. They've been investigating insider threats for 20 years. And they have an analytics program, but yeah, they're still evolving that.
Sounds cool. Sounds interesting. I think, Faith, it would be good for us to include that in our comments.
And written them down.
Yeah.
Even the critical pathway to insider risk.
Yes,
That's the first time
very
I've heard of it.
foundational.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. I think I'm relatively through to my questions. Faith, do you still have anything that you want to clarify? Or
I think the last question that I'd like to ask is, what type of background or how do people get into this insider risk field?
As in helping organizations, not being the insider themselves.
If you look at yeah,
just clarifying for the audience.
Well, we run a job board, and so we get to see what companies are hiring for that. I would say most people in this domain come from an intelligence or law enforcement background. There are pluses and minuses to that. So they have an investigative background, but again, you're really are trying to catch the bad people. And you're more on the detect and respond than you are on the preventative. Yeah. I do think there's a lot of opportunity for behavioral psychiatrists or psychologists, HR people. You know, this is traditionally be sold to the CISO because they're already working on external threats. So you're going to wear this new hat, and the CISOs are trying to solve this through tools because they probably, you know,
that's what they're used to.
Yeah, they rise through the ranks on the command line, and that's what they believe in tools. But fundamentally, insider risk is about a human being interacting with their environment, and we don't have enough people who understand the psychology of individuals and organizational psychology. So there's a great need to get more of these people involved in the field. HR people, I think there's a great opportunity for people with that background who want to get involved. It doesn't have to be in law enforcement, and like I said, there's a place for an investigative background, but it's not the whole domain.
Wow,
that's good.
So if you're into psychology, then you got a place in cybersecurity and the insider risk.
And you can really shape this field. You can really make a name for yourself with some good research. Yeah, I think there's great opportunities.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, I guess let's wrap up.
Yeah, I think I'm good for now. First of all, Erik, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know that you're extremely busy, and we really, really appreciate it. Any last final words that you want to share with us?
Yes, I would just say that insider risk is, depending on your industry, it's definitely something that you should look at. I do think it's solvable, you know, because we come up against that. So do take this risk seriously. I think many organizations have invested a lot on their external perimeter, and the attackers know this, and they realize that a few thousand euros and you're behind all the controls. It's really cost efficient. But I really appreciate the opportunity to present this topic because it doesn't get enough airtime, and I think I really appreciate that, and I think you're doing a service to your loyal fans that you've done so, because they're going to hear more about it in the future. So Faith and Jennifer, thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Yes. That being said, again, Erik, thank you so much for joining us. For our viewers, for our listeners, thank you again also for joining us. If you want to participate in the conversations like Erik did today, please reach out to us. Same if you have a suggestion for a new topic. And other than that, thank you guys. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.